think this is a celebration for all people. Black people especially really want to honor how far we've come while also acknowledging how far we still need to go.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
So my name is Ayana King. I live in Michigan too, in Wyandotte, and I run a small agency called Maximum Communications, and I really help organizations and communities learn and advocate for more diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I'm Eldon Beery, and I live in University Living in Ann Arbor.
It's good to meet you, Eldon.
You too.
You have some questions for me about Juneteenth?
Well, what does it celebrate? I've heard, but it's new to me.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, Juneteenth is actually celebrated nationally on June 19th, and it really marks the end of legalized enslavement. It's actually when enslaved folks in Texas were told about the Emancipation Proclamation, which had happened actually 2 years earlier.
I experienced some of that many years later when in Memphis, Tennessee, the enslavement was over, but the entrapment was not. And,
Yeah. People will say, well, if the Emancipation Proclamation happened 2 years earlier, why didn't enslaved Texans just leave? Why didn't they just leave? The simple answer is that they couldn't, okay? They couldn't. The Confederacy was still very much active and fighting in Texas. And so even though the Emancipation Proclamation had, in fact, emancipated those enslaved people all over the South, that did not happen in Texas because those folks were living under threat. So many of them knew that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken place already 2 years earlier, but they were terrorized into remaining enslaved. That's the short answer. Maybe that's the longer answer, Eldon.
maybe it's not over yet.
In many ways, some folks will say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. What else did you want to ask me about Juneteenth?
Well, there is still discrimination against the African American people, the blacks.
Mm-hmm.
I have trouble knowing, depending on which community I'm in, what term to use to describe black people is unique.
I love that you asked that question because I think that makes people uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah.
And they say, should I say black? Should I say African American? And I think that people are especially sensitive around this time of year when we're celebrating Juneteenth, which celebrates, that emancipation, finally, for black folks. And I think that black is appropriate. I am a black woman. I am a black person. Although there's nothing wrong with saying African American at all, I think the reason that maybe we have moved away from that is because African American assumes that every black person you encounter, right, in our country is indeed African American, and they may not be, right? They may be Afro-Latina. They may be from some other, country of origin and be black. And so black is a good descriptor. And I think that black is beautiful, so it's okay if you say black and black woman.
I had my mother spent about 10 years of her life in North Dakota, and the American Indians were facing some of those same kind of issues there. They'd been plowed all around and were abused still. People were afraid of them because some of them were still fighting. But,
After enslaved folks in Texas received news, many of them celebrated. They were, feeling joyous. And many white people who were not happy with the emancipation terrorized them, brutalized them. and continued, as we know, right, continued to discriminate against them
Oh, yeah.
for generations. And we see the effects of that today. So I'm glad that you're so interested in Juneteenth. And maybe, I know one of the questions you were asking before was sort of who celebrates it and why, too.
I've never celebrated Juneteenth before,
Yeah.
but I've been very much involved in the freedom of slavery, and
Yes.
the one of the most exciting places I lived was Birmingham, Alabama during the race riots,
Wow.
and I was able to incorporate black people into the congregation I served, a Cumberland Presbyterian Church.
Yeah. You still, even though you were different, right, in maybe the way that you celebrated, maybe the way that you acknowledged your faith, you still did it, right? And so the same could be true. You said, I'd never celebrated Juneteenth before. I didn't even know what it is. And so I think what happens is a lot of people who are not from the black community say, well, is it for us to celebrate? Should we acknowledge it at all? And the question is yes, especially for people like you who were already sort of doing this work many, many years ago to make sure that black folks, all black folks, would be accepted, would be welcomed, would feel a part of the larger community because they are, right? And so I think that tradition should continue. And even if folks are not from the black community, they can and should still both acknowledge, honor, and even celebrate Juneteenth. So you might be wondering, well, how can I do that? What are some ways that I might be able to do that? Do you have any ideas yourself?
I don't know, I think my focus has been on a broader range than just black and white.
Okay.
In Ann Arbor First Presbyterian, their focus has been on accepting people of different sexual orientation, for
Love
example.
that. Especially because it's Pride Month also, so I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think we need to learn to accept people in their differences and their unique quality.
That's right.
And it's not easy for our culture to do. We have to work at that some.
Yeah. And we are working at it. Like you and I are working at it right now. So even when people are saying, how might I celebrate? How might I honor? How might I acknowledge? You are really taking a step in doing that right now because you are wanting to learn about it. Now, some other ways that people might choose to honor, acknowledge, celebrate, you can go to African American museums, museums of African descent with African history, right? You can engage in community celebrations.
In Detroit, there's just some pretty good black.
Yes, the Charles H.
Museum.
Wright Museum, the Detroit Historical Museum.
Yeah.
Lots of museums will have celebrations. All folks should attend those. It's a really wonderful way for you to both understand the cultural significance of Juneteenth, which, by the way, was not made a national holiday until 2021 under the Biden administration. So there are some things that you can do to honor and celebrate, and immersing yourself in learning is a really great way. Another really great way to acknowledge and celebrate and honor Juneteenth is just by being in community with other black folks. You can patronize different restaurants and stores. And again, I think just learning, just really immersing yourself in the learning, and then not just the learning, but the sharing. So I always say when you learn something about someone or about a community that has been foreign to you, don't just hoard that information for yourself and feel good to yourself, like I learned something new today. No, take it back to your community and folks who you have influence with and share it with them. So those are some ways that you might be able to do that. What else did you want to know about Juneteenth?
I guess the focus on that is too narrow for me.
In what way?
It's focused on the Emancipation Proclamation,
Not quite though.
isn't it?
It's not focused on the Emancipation Proclamation because remember that had already happened 2 years prior.
Yeah.
What it does celebrate is finally Texans themselves
Yeah.
who had not been freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. It really celebrates and highlights them because it was under Juneteenth.
But
They were the last.
We need to work on today, not then.
But, right, in order to work on today, we'd have to know the past.
Was there still discrimination against newly freed people?
There was, and you had mentioned that earlier, that discrimination continues. Sure. So after enslaved people were freed because of the ratification of the Emancipation Proclamation, things didn't just, as we see today, right? Things didn't just, go from being this oppressive, sort of heavy sort of society into all of a sudden this free, loving, and willing society. That's not what happened. There was a lot of discrimination, and we saw what happened over history, over time, legalized lynching. There were just lots of things that happened, right?
I saw a lot of that.
I'm sure you did.
Birmingham, Alabama.
Yes. So when I say legalized, I won't say that it was, yeah, you can go out and do these things, but I will say that the law did not work in the favor of those people who were being terrorized. And so, yeah, we saw a lot of discrimination after the Emancipation Proclamation. And because of that, we still see, the residual discrimination of that permeating our society today. I really love the fact that we're here having this conversation about Juneteenth because it also highlights that we can continue to learn new information and build community no matter what our age is.
Juneteenth just focuses on racial differences, though, doesn't it?
I don't think its focus is on the racial differences, although obviously race can't be denied, right? I think the real focus is on let us celebrate that finally all enslaved people are deemed free from this oppressed system that really took families apart, that ripped families apart, that did a lot of things that still hurt us as a nation today. But you mentioned we should focus on today instead of the past. This is how we do that.
Is it okay for people who are not descendants of enslaved people to celebrate Juneteenth?
Absolutely. I think this is a celebration for all people. I think that Black people especially celebrate it, honor it. And let me say this, Black Texans, okay? So if you talk to people from Texas, they've always known about Juneteenth. We're in Michigan, right? This was newer to us. I'll say in the last 5 or 6 years, we began to learn more about Juneteenth. So certainly the people who were maybe not descendants of enslaved people, maybe they were descendants of the enslaver, okay? Those people should also know about Juneteenth. Those people should also celebrate history. Those people should also really want to honor how far we've come while also acknowledging how far we still need to go.
The discriminators as well as the discriminated.
Yes. I think it's a learning opportunity for all people.
And it goes even beyond race.
Definitely.
Women have had that challenge. That was one of my activities in the Presbyterian Church. Mm-hmm. We had only one ordained woman in the Presbytery of Detroit when I was moderator.
Yes.
And I was managed to pull off 5
Wow.
and 5 African American pastors.
Wow.
In the next 2 years.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Well.
So you see how we take Juneteenth, but this could be a broader conversation any day of the week, I'm sure.
That's right.
What other questions did you have for me?
Well, do people view Juneteenth as divisive?
I'm sure some people do.
Okay.
Very much in the same way that we see some people who don't understand why we have Pride Month, or who don't understand why there needs to be a Black History Month or a Native American Heritage Month. There will always be people.
So it's a discrimination against the Black people.
I think
in their mind.
It could be, right? Some people do feel that Juneteenth is divisive because I think we have such a hard time talking about race that people don't want to acknowledge, celebrate, or talk about anything that highlights race. because we have such a hard time talking about race.
I know that's true.
It is true, right? And I think especially for older generations, I think about my dad who was a boomer. His generation was, you don't talk about it. You don't talk about faith or politics. You certainly don't talk about racism in the workplace and even in larger communities, right?
Almost used to be illegal to do that in some of the workplaces.
Yeah. See, so still divisive, yet we press on.
I think it's good to talk about it
I think
and
so
to
too.
share your information about what's happened in your life with others.
You know,
That's why I enjoy talking to you.
oh, thank you. That's why I enjoy talking to you and other people too. I just feel like when you talk to people outside of your own communities, you have an opportunity to learn. When you have an opportunity to learn, you also have an opportunity to unlearn some of those things that you thought were true because they were handed down to you, right? So I think we should continue to have conversations.
And people need to have opportunity to talk about their beliefs
Yes,
in order to help them grow.
yes, yes.
Most
But that's a
people-
skill set.
Most people think of ministry as preaching, but it's also a lot about listening. I was more into counseling than into, well, I preached too, but the
Yeah.
counseling that went on afterward was important.
Yeah, yeah. So we do need to have conversation and counsel and continue to communicate with each other as we're learning.
Very much,
Yeah.
yeah.
Did you have any other questions about Juneteenth?
I don't think so. You've answered them well.
I have some questions for you then.
Okay.
Knowing your background and the way that you have been a connector for both your community of faith and maybe even your cultural community, right? And how you have been really engaged in bringing people together, how might you talk about Juneteenth maybe to some of your peers here?
We've been talking about it.
You have.
Your
Okay.
information now has helped us talk about it better.
Okay. I love to hear that because what was my assumption is that you weren't talking about it, right?
We weren't.
That was my assumption.
We think about and talk about racial issues, but not about the proclamation as such. That seems kind of narrow to me. It's
Okay.
the Juneteenth,
Okay. Well,
but it's an important part of it.
it is. It's a very important part of it. So do you think you feel more empowered to have those conversations about Juneteenth with maybe some of your friends and neighbors here?
And I feel open to that. Some of my friends and neighbors here can't talk very much.
Well, that happens sometimes, right? But they might be good listeners.
Maybe.
Yeah. I think that's
I
really
think
good.
it's important to live it.
Yeah. Yes. Say that part again.
I think it's important to live it.
I think
not
it's important
just
to
to
live
talk
it.
about it.
Yes. I think that's the other thing that we have to be able to demonstrate that we are people who are safe and who are learning. And yes, the head knowledge is important, but the activation of that head knowledge is even more important. So I'm so happy that you brought that up.
That's why we need you here more often, not just
Oh.
for one interview. We need you. There are African American people here on the staff,
Yes.
and I've gotten to know some of those pretty well, but they kind of come and go, and they're not always as comfortable talking about racial issues
Of course.
because it's awkward and
Yes. Definitely.
uncomfortable.
Definitely. And that's why we do these conversations, and I'm so glad about the questions you asked because it can be uncomfortable. And I think that when we feel insecure about our head knowledge on a certain topic, we tend not to ask questions or to engage. But when we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we are talking about creating community, we only do that through engaging one another and by being vulnerable. And so sometimes when we're vulnerable, we worry about making a mistake or saying the wrong thing. And that really just is part of the process and is sometimes unavoidable, which is why I was so happy that you asked me the question earlier today about how would I like to be addressed. as a Black woman, African American, we used some other words, and I said, times change. This is what communication does for us. It helps us to learn, and I think it also helps us to relax.
And to be able to talk to a woman about intellectual ideas is important.
Yes.
I spent a lot of my time trying to, as I mentioned earlier, to help women be free in ministry. And
yes.
For a while, they were in the background only, doing the hard things.
Yes. There are lots of ways to be free, and there are lots of ways to be enslaved.
Right.
Even today. So I'm so glad that even as you say, at 94 years old, you are still doing work, and I appreciate you. As we wrap up our conversation here, what I do want to say is, it sounds to me like you've had a long legacy of bringing people together, different people together, people of different races and ethnicities and nationalities, beliefs and backgrounds.
That's what the Christian faith is about.
That's what it's about. So I thank you for your curiosity in asking me about Juneteenth today. And because I know that you are still in community, I ask that you take that information back and share it.
Good.
It was good to talk to you today, Eldon.
And good to talk to you.
Thank you.
You've taught me a lot.
You've taught me a lot too, honestly. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Good.
And I think to myself, what a wonderful